I was recently sitting through a continuing education course for my nutrition diplomate renewal, and I heard something that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. The presenter said very confidently that TMAO is associated with neuroinflammation. Then, later in the same talk, they praised eggs as a key food for brain health. Here's the problem. Eggs are rich in choline, which is one of the very nutrients that they say raises TMAO. You cannot have it both ways here. And a little later, he went on to say that the Mediterranean diet was protective for dementia. Well, that diet includes lean meats and fish. Both are sources of carnitine and TMA precursors. So again, you cannot have it both ways here. That contradiction is what triggered me to shoot this video because I knew that from my prior research that the TMA story was just not that simple. So I did what I always do, and I went back and I started looking for human clinical trials, and I asked one question. Does TMAO from real food, especially from red meat, actually cause brain inflammation in humans? The answer? It left me shocked. Let me give you the simple version of this conversation so we don't get lost in the science. When you hear TMAO causes neuroinflammation, almost all of that information comes from animal studies where extremely high dosages were used, dosages that don't correlate to what humans are exposed to. These studies are what are known as observational human studies, and they can only show associations. They maybe show how things can be shown together or show up together, but they don't give you insight into causation, what the actual cause is. When you look at the human interventional trials related to TMAO, there's not a single trial that shows TMAO, a single human clinical trial, that shows that TMAO by itself is directly involved in neuroinflammation in humans. Diets that raise TMAO, and that's going to include foods like fish, eggs, lean meats, they often improve or at a minimum don't have a negative impact on overall health markers. And even when you look at the impact of some medications that can positively affect heart and kidney outcomes, these same medications actually raise TMAO instead of lowering it. Well, that seems contradictory. All of this would seem to suggest that TMAO is not behaving like a simple toxin in the body as it's being made out to. So if it is behaving like a marker of what's happening in your gut, your kidneys, or your overall health, then it's not a molecule that's going to single-handedly ruin your brain. Again, that's an illogical conclusion to draw. And this is why the lecture that I referred to in the introduction can also suggest that when you consume eggs, they're great for the brain and overall health, and same for the Mediterranean diet, which helps protect against dementia, but yet in the same conversation also say that TMA from choline or carnitine sources are dangerous. Frankly, that logic just doesn't hold up when you follow it all the way through. Now, if you like where we're heading in this conversation so far, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button and drop a comment down if you've ever changed your diet because of seeing a scary headline about TMAO or just red meat in general. And if you've never watched one of my videos before, I'm Dr. Arland Hill. I'm a clinician and a rancher. That means I get to see both sides, the physiology and the food. And I can tell you this, if you zoom in and look at the full body of evidence, TMAO is more of a signal in your body than a sentence of a problem. So my goal here is to help you separate what the evidence actually shows from the fear that keeps getting layered in on top of it. Now, let's walk through the TMAO story step by step so you can make decisions about red meat, eggs, and brain health with clarity and not further confusion. As a primer, we should ask the question, what exactly is TMAO and why does it show up? TMAO stands for trimethylamine N oxide. not that important to get bogged down in that name. What is more relevant here is that it is produced when your gut bacteria metabolize compounds like choline, carnitine, and betaine. Betaine and choline being closely associated there. From that, the liver is going to convert the TMA, trimethylamine, to TMAO, trimethylamine oxide. And then this is a relevant point that you want to keep in mind as we go further into this conversation, is that TMAO also has to be cleared by the kidneys. So you can see the gut, the liver, and the kidneys are relevant to this conversation. Therefore, we should immediately be asking, well, what happens if there's impairments in any of those organs? Hang on to that thought. The foods that can raise TMAO, fish, eggs, red meat. Red meat is the one that's often most aggressively pointed to, but it also can be raised by eggs and fish. Especially some fish can be very high sources of TMAO, even more so than red meat. And TMAO is a byproduct of your normal microbial composition, normal microbial metabolism in the gut. It's a marker of how your gut and your liver are processing certain nutrients. But yet it's been branded as a toxin simply because higher levels show up in people who are already sick. It's this portion of being already sick that so often gets overlooked that we want to pay attention to. And what no one is telling you in just what I've shared with you up to this point is that fish, and again, I'll go back to this, fish is it's considered a heart healthy protein source. It's probably the protein source that is most often promoted for individuals that are being extremely attentive to cardiovascular health. But it often, again, raises TMAO more than beef in studies. That's important. You can't overlook that key fact. And your kidney function, your overall diet, your microbiome, those are all going to strongly influence your trimethylamine oxidase, your TMAO. So before we talk about risk, we have to just simply ask some simple questions. Are we looking at a cause, or are we just witnessing how the body is already functioning under a state of stress? Headlines related to healthcare topics can often be misleading, predominantly because they confuse association versus causation. They can seem to present studies in a very scary context. And this TMAO story, well, it's no different. And keep in mind that ultimately what I'm trying to lead you up to in today's conversation is to take away the fear that's associated with red meat because of this one concern and legitimize that it is not a concern. So in doing that, understand that when you see these scary headlines, if you will, most of these are derived from observational studies. They're looking at things from a very high level. Retrospectively, in the majority of these cases, people with higher levels of TMAO, when you look at these studies, they also seem to show previous heart disease. They've got chronic diseases like diabetes. Many have been hospitalized. They even have kidney disease. And if you think through the kidney disease, that would simply suggest that you're not clearing TMAO out as part of your normal excretion through your urine. Well, what happens there? You start building up TMAO levels. And you can see that individuals with kidney disease can have TMAO levels that are anywhere from 4 to 40 times higher than healthy individuals. Interesting that TMAO is also seen when you have observation of cognitive decline, generally unhealthy individuals, and when there's an overall disease burden. When you look at preclinical, this is the other thing that gets used a lot of times, preclinical studies where they're using rodent models. The most obvious thing to note here is that humans and rodents are not the same thing, and rodent studies can give insight and they can be a starting point, but they should not be interpreted the same way. Rodent models where high doses of TMAO worsen your blood vasculature or create brain inflammation, the problem with those studies is that the dosages are significantly higher than what are seen in humans, literally up to 50 times or more higher. And the TMAO is being administered directly. It, in some studies, is injected. It can be spiked in the water and given through very high oral administration. This is not mimicking human physiology. You're taking the entire gut component out of the conversation when you do that. My point here is that this information, it doesn't translate. So that's why this does not prove causation. Observational studies can only tell you that things show up together. Higher TMAO may simply mean that the person has poor kidney clearance. They have a poor dietary pattern. They have an advanced disease state. We have to ask these questions. That's what the observational studies would suggest. The animal studies. Are you using dosages, or do the conditions that the study is being implemented under actually reflect normal human intake? No, they don't. It's useful for a hypothesis, but it's not great for drawing clinical recommendations. You just can't do that with these types of studies, but yet that's what this entire narrative has been based around. All of the nuance that is related to TMAO gets stripped away, and what you're left with is that red meat raises TMAO, or TMAO causes disease. So you end up cutting out nutrient-dense foods without really solving the issue of what's going on with the microbiome. Is there any type of metabolic dysfunction? Do certain organs need support? What's the actual driver of the inflammation? None of these things get answered when there's just the simple connection of just take TMAO out and it'll all be better, or just take red meat out because it's not going to raise TMAO and everything's going to be more optimal. That doesn't translate into human physiology and biochemistry. It doesn't work that way. So let's look at the human intervention trials for what they actually are. That's what needs to be looked at, where you'd expect to see that if there was harm from TMAO, that you could isolate that it was an individual driver, and that just hasn't been done. To look at the full picture here, we do need to look at human trials and see what they're really showing. So the first one we'll look at is with choline supplementation. High-dose choline has been shown to raise TMAO, which has been suggested to increase platelet reactivity. Here's the problem with that, is that that information was generated from an ex vivo study. That simply means that it was done outside of the body. Well, we're interested in vivo, things that are happening inside of the body. And the intervention in this trial was that it was choline, but it wasn't TMAO directly. So again, difficult to draw these conclusions. The outcomes were also based off of lab platelet testing. It wasn't looking at an actual clinical event that occurred. And just to further that conversation, these platelet mechanistic studies, the ones that are looking at how the platelets are adhering to each other and driving potentially clotting mechanisms, human plasma and the platelets do spike with TMAO. So that there can be an association with that. But at physiological levels, it doesn't happen. So when you're hearing that it's affecting the dynamics of blood flow and the clotting mechanisms, understand that that's happening at much higher levels than what humans are exposed to. And so it doesn't show that there's really a connection here at all. And it truly pushes back on this notion that TMAO is this driver of cardiovascular disease because it causes this hypercoagulation process to take place. When you look at different animals that are giving these different animal foods, so again, fish, eggs, beef, and you do see that TMAO rises, understand that when you're looking at these studies, these cardiometabolic focused or oriented studies, they don't track very neatly TMAO. They just make a lot of inferences from this information. So sometimes stable or even improved, that when you look at the cardiometabolic state, you can see that it's stabilized or even improved when you see a higher amount of TMAO. But you don't hear that side of the story. And that's cherry picking data to drive a narrative. That's not aligning with human biochemistry. And then lastly, I'll point to here that some drug medications do raise TMAO, but again, they improve kidney function, they improve cardiovascular health. That's not what you'd expect if TMAO was a straightforward toxin. If TMAO were some simple poison, you would expect that raising it regardless would worsen outcomes. Not that it would increase or improve outcomes. That doesn't align with the way other toxins work. So if TMAO is not behaving like a simple toxin in humans, well, what exactly is it telling us? TMAO, it's a marker of your terrain of your body. It's not a standalone threat. TMAO is going to reflect what you're eating in your diet. It's going to take a look at how your microbiome is configured, the bacteria in your gut. It's going to look at how well your liver and your kidneys are working. And high TMAO also has to be acknowledged that it is predominantly looked at in sick populations. Often that just tells us that the terrain of the individuals in these populations is already in trouble. So a more practical view of this would be that if you looked at these in a metabolically healthy individual, someone who is eating nutrient-dense foods with good kidney function and good gut and liver balance, a modest rise in TMAO after a meal, that's just part of normal physiology. That's just, again, it's a signal being used throughout the body. It's not a toxin. So when we fixate on TMAO, we're missing the bigger picture of the drivers in inflammation. You have to acknowledge where that inflammation is coming from. Think about things like changes in sleep habits and how that affects the hormonal rhythm and how that can exacerbate the inflammatory cascades. You're looking at chronic blood sugar swings, ultra-processed food, a sedentary lifestyle, scenarios where you really have an imbalance in the microorganisms in the gut. And when you scare people away from foods that can truly actually help repair these systems, it's a disservice to the population. You're not being honest about what the bigger picture and bigger impact of these foods are, and it's just carrying a narrative. This is how we start to tie red meat back to brain health and really what you're consuming in your next meal. When you properly raise red meat, so when we consume properly grass-fed, grass-finished beef, when maybe that's also, you could include in this bison, lamb, goat, those are also excellent sources of red meat that can be incorporated in a grass-finished scenario. Those are going to provide ample levels of B12, iron, zinc, creatine, carnitines, choline will be in there, CLA, the conjugated linoleic acid, the omega-3s that we've heard so much about. All of these are going to be supportive of brain energy, neurotransmitter function, generally lowering inflammation. Does that sound like what we typically hear with TMAO? It doesn't. And when it's eaten, especially as part of a whole diet with adequate fiber and plant polyphenols, this concern is reduced even more. Your risk is far more shaped by your overall dietary pattern. If you're consuming sugar and seed oils and processed snacks, or you've got a lifestyle that is sedentary, you're not optimizing your sleep, you're not being active, not exercising, you're exposing yourself to chronic stress, all of these things are stacking up. They're creating a terrain in your body that's suboptimal, meaning that you're not going to have the balance of the microorganisms in your gut. You're going to see impairments in your overall organ function. You're not going to have optimal integrity of your gastrointestinal tract. And therefore, in that light, TMAO has to be put into context. It's a piece of the overall picture, and it's not a standalone verdict against red meat. Now, when I look at this through the lens of a clinician, to me, this conclusion is very simple. Your brain needs nutrient-dense proteins and fats more than it needs a perfectly low level of a TMAO number. You need all of these nutrients that come in through red meat, through properly raised red meat, and I would take that over having an extremely low TMAO level, just because I understand that the benefits to all of those nutrients working synergistically is going to give far more benefit to my health than just simply trying to target and lower a TMAO number. And as a rancher, that's exactly why here at Harvest Hills Ranch, we raise grass-fed and grass-finished beef. All of our animals are raised on pasture when we raise poultry, because I know that those foods are going to further optimize the terrain in the body, and we're not just trying to offset hunger, we're actually feeding the body the key nutrients that it needs. And if I took a look at my own health personally, I'll take my level of vitality that I currently experience on a day-to-day basis over an elevated TMAO level any day. I'll take that chance based on what I see as far as evidence out there. The real takeaway for you is that you want to stop treating TMAO like a villain. Start treating it as a marker in a much larger story about your microbiome, your kidney function, and just simply your overall dietary pattern. If you want to protect your brain, focus on whole, unprocessed foods, prioritize nutrient-dense proteins that are raised properly, like the meats that we've talked about, even getting some good quality fish in there if you want to include that in your diet. Do things that are going to support the terrain of your body, building an environment in your body that is optimal for long-term health, and let TMAO fall into place as part of a healthier system. Let it exist and fluctuate throughout the body as it needs to, and not as a molecule that is going to dictate what you put on your menu or not. That's how you use the science without becoming a victim of what you see in these headlines and these mouthpieces out there that keep promoting this narrative. You should question everything. And frankly, that mindset is what brought you this video today. It's not about paranoia. It's just about staying educated with the facts so you can actually get the foods into your diet that are going to yield the most benefit for you. Red meat and TMAO, well, they've been easy targets over the last decade, but when you step back and you look at the actual human evidence, the story is a lot more nuanced than some meat chemical equals brain damage. You just can't narrow it down to that simplistic of an outcome. And if this information that I've shared with you today, if it helped you breathe a little bit easier about eating real food, don't forget to give this video a like and share it with someone else who's been afraid of consuming red meat because of what they saw in the headline or what they heard someone on a podcast or some other outlet say. That's not based on hard data. And if you haven't watched part 1 or part 2 of my red meat and depression video series yet, well, you're going to see them there on the screen right now. And that's where I'm going to show you how properly raised red meat actually supports mood, energy, and brain health.